All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us, the Greater Kuwaia Groundwater Sustainability Agency, for the Groundwater Pumping Cap Allocation Update webinar. Before we get started into any of our content, I am going to go ahead and pass the mic to our Spanish interpreter, Reina Rodriguez, who's on the line, to give some instructions on how to join the Spanish interpretation line. Just a few housekeeping items. I wanted to let everyone know all the attendees' videos and microphones are turned off. So you should only be able to see panelist video as well as the PowerPoint slides. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online as soon as possible, in addition to the PowerPoint slides. For questions and answers, we do ask that folks use the Q&A to type a question at any time, and we'll go ahead and address those questions at the end of the presentation. For any technical difficulties, use the chat feature. So for any Zoom issues, go ahead and drop those questions into the chat box. For any questions on the content of the presentation, drop those into the Q&A. And you can see here on this slide, we have circles around the difference between the chat and the Q&A button. So if you hover over your Zoom menu, you should be able to see those options. So what we will be covering, a brief refresher on what the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is, who the Greater Kuwaia Groundwater Sustainability is, an update on concepts currently being considered on limiting groundwater pumping, how to participate in developing this regulation, and an update on the Kuwaia dashboard rollout. And I'm going to hand it over to our panelists over here, Eric, for introduction.
I'll start off. Hi, my name is Chris Tantaw. I'm a farmer. I farm in the Greater Kuwaia, also in the East Kuwaia. And I'm on the board of Kuwaia Delta Water Conservation District, and I represent our interest on the Greater Kuwaia Groundwater Management Agency. So that's my role.
Eric Osterling, General Manager of the Greater Kuwaia Groundwater Sustainability Agency.
Don Mills, President of the Greater Kuwaia Groundwater Sustainability Agency.
Johnny Gailey, I'm with Delta View Water Association, and I'm on the stakeholder committee of the Greater Kaweah GSA.
All right, Eric, for Sigma 101, handing it back to you.
That's the reason for the poll, to make sure I'm not spending too much time on this and we can get to the newer items for those who've participated in the past. I will be going through these slides rather quickly. The slides and this recording will be available from our website, so rest assured you will have access to that after the fact. So just in general, Sigma 101, it's a comprehensive legislation going back to 2014, signed by Governor Brown. It mandates that we are sustainable by 2040, and it grants local control to groundwater sustainability agencies such as ours, either individual agencies or a conglomerate, which is how we're formed as a joint powers agency of multiple public agencies. Next slide. This is just the general Sigma design. We have already gone through 2 of these bubbles, and the third one is to implement our plan that was submitted in January of 2020. And then again, we have to achieve our objectives by 2040. This is just a summary infographic of GSA authorities. The Act does leverage existing authorities for public agencies, as well as provides new authorities that are necessary to some of the things that are required of groundwater sustainability agencies. Next slide. This doesn't come without a cost. Unfortunately, this was an unfunded mandate, so GSAs like ours are required to find our own source of revenue in order to cover operational costs and some of the very expensive planning and monitoring and implementation needs related to Sigma implementation. We have a significant problem in our sub-basin. We average an annual average overdraft of our groundwater aquifer of 80,000 acre feet. So some years it's much more than that, and some years we get a rebound because it's wet. And then again, we have to address that issue by 2040. So it's not overnight that we have to correct that issue. It's a glide path. Next slide. This just gives an idea of some of the components of our groundwater sustainability plan, which is our guiding principle document. It contains everything about what the problem is and how we're going to fix it. Next slide, please. These are the sustainability challenges that the regulation requires us to address. The only one that we've crossed out here is not an issue as seawater intrusion, although we have had some recent discussion on surface water depletions, and that's one of the more limited issues for us too. The other four, the lowering of levels, storage, degraded water quality, and land subsidence, we all see those as substantial issues in this region. This is our area. There are 3 GSAs. We are the largest, half of the Sub-Basin, 440,000 acre basin, and we're 220,000 of it. The other 2 are East Kaweah GSA in yellow-orange there, and Mid Kaweah GSA. Next slide. Okay, keep going. So we were formed in 2016. There was a deadline of July 2017 to form your agencies by, and everybody in the state, 99% I think of the areas that had to do that made it by that deadline. We're a JPA. Here's our membership. We're led by a board of directors. 2 of my directors are here sitting with me, and several committees, and one of my committee members is here sitting as a panelist. We have 3 primary committees that are specific to our GSA, the stakeholder, rural community, and technical advisory, and then there's also a basin-wide advisory group that we appoint, each GSAs appoint members to for policy-related discussion. Next slide. Here's our representatives for each of the entities that comprise our board of directors. Next slide. Here are some other, this is a non-exhaustive list of some additional participating agencies and entities. Next slide. And if you want to get involved just in general, not just specific to this particular activity that we're here to talk about today, but we do have open public meetings for all of our committees and of course our board. The committees all meet quarterly at least, if not more frequently, and the board meets monthly and sometimes more frequently there too if we have a special need, which we just did on Monday. We had a special meeting. And then really we also have different workshops like we have today that you can participate in the discussion of development of various projects, programs, and policies. Next slide. Okay, here's our website. And what we're here to talk about today is the groundwater pumping cap proposal. So this has been a somewhat iterative process. We intended it to be that way so that we weren't just receiving comments during our public comment period, that we were talking about some of those comments and making certain policy decisions and change in thinking out in the open. So next slide, please. But these are still draft. We're still in our public comment period right now. So all of this is subject to change, although it's starting to solidify a bit in some areas. Next slide. Okay, so what's the plan? We're going to continue direct public outreach and communication. Oh, this is an old slide. Is there? Okay, summary. Thank you. Okay, so this is a summary of some of the discussion. For those of you who, this is really more intended for those people who've joined us previously and who have read our draft rules and regulations. Here are some of the changes. Is this the first slide? Okay. I'm sorry. It advanced through slides really quickly there. So here are some of the new forms of thinking by the board of directors. The board has directed legal counsel to perform some non-substantive cleanup of the document to address comments received from Mark Larson of Kuwaia Delta. They're supportive of transfers of groundwater between GSAs by the same entity or enterprise on a case-by-case basis. The current rules and regulations says that transfers can only occur within the GSA, and so there's a new thinking on that on a case-by-case basis. The new position of the board right now is that the sustainable yield leaves behind where it was 10% annual over 5 years, so you lose 10% each year. It's just a one-time 10%, so that's a little bit better for folks who are carrying over. And The board maintains its intent to implement the allocation of the regulation or the implementation of it on October 1st. So there was consideration of possibly speeding up the schedule because of the dry condition, but they decided to keep the original schedule. So you're not held accountable until October 1st of 2022 with any of this. Next slide. Okay, other changes in thinking or solidifying of thinking is that sections pertaining to public water systems, there is a placeholder in the draft right now that is identified for public water systems. We're going to take that out and handle those and some other exceptions differently than irrigated agriculture. We have been working with public water systems to come up with an equitable solution where there is skin in the game and that it's fair. The board is supportive of using a report by Four Creeks and milk producers that estimates dairy facility net groundwater use. So we are using a monitoring product that's satellite-based to estimate groundwater pumping, and that doesn't work on a commercial property where it isn't able to estimate that from vegetation because there is no vegetation. The board has also recently set the pumping cap. We were operating in a range of 2.5 to 3 of ET, and they have set it at 2.75 acre feet per acre of evapotranspiration based on an evaluation that was conducted by our technical consultant, and then what it states in our adopted groundwater sustainability plan that we will tackle 5% of the overall problem in the first 5 years, and then incrementally tackle more of it as we move towards 2040. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to go over how that changes the look of the overall pumping cap portion of the rules and regs. This infographic will be familiar to some. I have updated it to reflect the 2.75 acre feet per acre. Again, we want to emphasize and encourage the use of surface water supply as a base supply in an irrigation setting, and then dip into the sustainable yield, which is at no cost. Actually, it's rolled into a cost that you might have seen on your property tax that is an acreage-based assessment that we justified through a Proposition 218 election about a year ago. There is then 2 temporary tiers, Tier 1 in yellow and Tier 2 in orange, and that makes up the balance of that 2.75 acre feet. And so that sustainable yield in green is 10 inches, and then the Tier 1 and Tier 2 are the remaining inches that comprise that 2.75. And then lastly, the prohibited tier, that's when you get into penalty, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide. So here's some more detail. The intentional groundwater recharge activities will be accounted for separately, so they're not really identified in that infographic, but there is a separate accounting for credits. It anticipates an annual allocation. There have been some discussion and comments on giving a block of years allocation instead of just annually, and that still is a possibility, so get your comments in if that's something you support. It does not yet apply to public water systems, as I mentioned. Landowners allocated the sustainable yield, which is currently 10 inches, and that's based on estimates that we did in coordination with the other 2 GSAs in the development of our groundwater sustainability plans, and it uses an average hydrology between the years 1997 and 2017, where there was a mixed bag of wet and dry years. Tiered groundwater, so temporary tiered groundwater is being offered as temporary and optional. And total pumping caps, the sustainable yield plus tiers 1 and tier 2 of 2.75 is still being evaluated, but we've narrowed it down to 275 as opposed to that range that I described earlier. All assessed acreage under this regulation is treated equally. There was some discussion about treating different users and uses of groundwater differently. It was determined by the board that everybody would be treated equally, and the pumping cap would be applied to them. The one exception, and you'll see this in the detail later in the slides, is undeveloped land. Some non-assessed acreage will require special agreements. So there were properties that were split by our boundary between the 2 GSAs and even between sub-basin boundaries that had to be excluded in that property tax, Prop 218. And in order to receive an allocation and have the ability to pump, they will need to come to a negotiated agreement on the acreage that's inside our GSA versus outside of it. Next slide. Okay, this is just given a summary of the tiers. The pricing, what's important about this is that it is set annually. So this initial placeholder of $75 per acre foot of ET for tier 1 and $125 is a pretty reasonable placeholder, but the board could opt to change that number depending on our financial needs. The prohibitive tier, there's written into the state legislation a dollar amount of $500 per acre foot, and then the board has observed that there's probably some people that would be willing to pay nearly anything for water if they really need it. And so the real pain comes in at an aggregate of a 1-to-1 reduction in your future allocation if you exceed and spill into the prohibited tier. Tier pumping will be reduced over time, so even that 2.75 acre feet per acre at the starting point, but it is anticipated that ultimately by 2040 that number will be reduced pretty significantly, maybe even by as much as a foot or more. Managed aquifer recharge, which is a term that was coined by the state, and so it's just common nomenclature. It's really the credits for intentional recharge and use of recycled water will be accounted for separately. Next slide. So terminology is important, and the word carryover is a common one that's used in surface water, especially in the context of surface storage behind dams. And it's really no different. If you don't use the water that you have, you carry it over to another year. We need to be sensitive to surface water users and not force them to pump. So if we create a use it or lose it situation, that might force them to pump in lieu of using surface water and keeping that in storage. And so we're trying to disincentivize that. There is a maximum of 5 years rolling for sustainable yield supply with a one-time 10% leave behind of whatever the current balance is. And then the remaining balance does not get hit with an additional reduction percentage. There's a maximum of 5 years rolling for tier 1 and tier 2 supply with an annual 10 to 20% leave behind. And so that is annual. It's not a one-time reduction for carryover that you see under sustainable yield. Anything that is past 2015, previously undeveloped land, no access to tier water. And I think actually that's been changed to the adoption date of our plan of 2020. So that was another one that I didn't catch in this PowerPoint presentation. I apologize, but we have softened on that too. Next slide, please. Transferability of groundwater, so the moving groundwater from one place to the other. The sustainable yield of both tiers may be transferred. There is an online water dashboard, which will be presented later, that will monitor those activities. We are currently evaluating a distance limitation of 3 to 5 miles. That's much more of a discretionary circumstance where, somebody could petition for maybe a greater distance to be able to transfer their water. And all of the properties without wells calculated by would be calculated by the centroid of the parcel. So if you had an undeveloped piece of property that didn't have a well, but you wanted to transfer that native supply to another property, we would use the centroid to calculate the radius. Centroid, I should say. And right now, the current draft describes a requirement to install a meter on your well and start reporting that data for the privilege of being able to transfer or carry over. After 5 years, there's a loss of transferability of tier 2, and tier 1, the loss of transferability would occur in future years. Next slide. A measurement. This is something that we've really struggled with how to measure, and really the most accurate form of measurement in most opinions is well metering. However, it takes a lot of time and money in order to accomplish that. We have about 4,000 wells just in our GSA. And so in lieu of that, because we're mostly irrigated lands, with crops growing on them. We have opted to use a company called Land IQ, who uses satellites to estimate evapotranspiration, or the amount of water that the plant actually transpires or evaporates. ET is not necessarily equal to pumping because you have to be 100% efficient for it to be equal. There are very few properties that even come close to being 100% efficient as far as the amount they pump versus how much the plant uses. Measuring actual pumping addresses all undesirable results and encourages efficient use of groundwater. So one of the challenges with just using ET is that if you have a crop that flood irrigates and it's a crop that is growing on heavier soils with the cork and clay below it, it takes a lot longer for that irrigation return flow to get back down into the aquifer where we can see its impact on the groundwater elevations that we're monitoring. I touched on this earlier: well fields, dairy operations, industrial netted orchards, and other types of uses that ET cannot be used for. We're going to have to figure out something else. And so dairy was a big one. We have about, I think, Johnny, 200 dairies in our GSA.
That's close.
Yeah, and so that was one that we needed to address pretty immediately. Next slide. Okay, so measuring pumping and credits. So credits is really something that we're talking to mostly the surface water purveyors who want to get credited for either intentional recharge or some of the unlined canal losses, the seepage that occurs there because the water that is seeping is their property. We have maintained, or our board has a position of the burden of proof is on the beneficiary, so whoever's benefiting from a credit would need to be the one to prove that the credit is justified through pictures, measurement. It's basically case by case on how that would work. And the dashboard, again, will manage that crediting. I will give a little bit more information on the dashboard in a bit. There is an appeals process, and it's not just one process. There's a number of different things that are appealable, and the board is definitely supportive of creating those methods that landowners who either want to challenge a credit amount or maybe their ET amount and other things can have a way to do that. Next slide. Drinking water pumping, a number that's important there is, I don't know if a whole lot of people really understand what the amount of gross pumping public water systems actually do on an acre foot per acre basis. And we calculate 1.2 to 1.4 for most valley cities. Here in Farmersville, it's 1.3. And we know that number because they have to report it to the state through actual metered information. So using that number is what we negotiated with an ad hoc committee of drinking water interests to come up with something equitable. None of the GSAs are currently contemplating any kind of immediate oversight or regulation of domestic wells. Most domestic wells would fall under an exemption that's written into the law, and that is de minimis pumpers who use an amount of 2 acre-feet per acre per year or less for domestic purposes only. So for drinking water, sanitation, and just general residential landscape. Next slide. Okay, so this is likely to generate a lot of revenue because a lot of people will have to dip into those temporary tiers 1 and 2 and possibly into the penalty tier as well. What do we do with that money? Well, there's been a lot of discussion about that. And that's also why the amounts set by the board annually for tier 1, tier 2 are really important, because we want to make sure that it meets our needs and not more than that. Any of this is going to require a public process to define various programs and projects. Our board's intent is to take the money that we receive through this regulation and put it back into the hands of the regulated community within our jurisdiction. Some of the possible ideas that have come up, and this is a non-exhaustive list once again, temporary and permanent land retirement. There's been discussion of a reverse auction or Dutch auction, some call it, where we would create a ranking criteria, applications on a voluntary basis would be submitted, and then the funds that were allocated for that particular use would be spent on working down the ranking list until the money was run out of for that particular fiscal cycle. Water conservation incentive programs, so not just changing land use, but we might be able to, in an agricultural setting, support programs and projects that put in efficient irrigation, or we've talked about meters. So, you know, with this wish or desire to go towards meters eventually, we are talking about even possibly retroactively accepting applications for those things. We don't want to disincentivize somebody who wants to put in a meter right now when we don't have this program defined just yet. And we do have the ability, it's one of the authorities provided to a GSA to go out and purchase surface water. That's a very rare instance though, considering that you have to move it somehow, and all of the conveyance infrastructure is owned and operated by our partners in irrigation districts and ditch companies. And then we are starting to develop a really close partnership with programs like CV Salts and the Irrigated Lands Program, who, like us, will be implementing mitigation programs. So while we are moving through this path to 2040 to achieve our ultimate sustainability goals, there is going to continue to be damage occurring to wells in particular. And so our plan does, in Section 7, describe a well mitigation program, which we are beginning to define, among other programs that are mitigative in nature. Next slide. Okay, just a quick reminder, a repeat of a previous slide of our next steps. Our final public webinar is today. We've had quite a few of these. They're all posted to our webpage. If you go to our website, off of the main page, there's a groundwater pumping cap link at the top. It takes you to a page that has all of the presentations, has all of our recorded videos. It has, of course, our rules and regulations document that is currently under public comment period that's been extended by a little more than 2 weeks actually, and other materials that are useful. We will be seeking the board's adoption of the rules and regulations, which will include this pumping cap in late May or early June, depending on how much discussion will be required based on comment letters that come in maybe at the end of the period, which we fully expect because that's usually how it goes. And then again, I said this earlier, but full implementation beginning October 1st, which is the beginning of the new water year, and that's the significance of that. So water year is October 1st to September 30th of each year. Slide. Your next steps. So we're coming to the conclusion of our public comment period, which ends on the 12th of this month, close of business. We encourage you to participate in upcoming workshops and meetings. We are working right now to schedule a combined stakeholder committee and rural communities committee. Those two committees meet together and have ever since I've been here for almost 4 years. And that'll likely be next Tuesday in the morning, and that'll be noticed. If you haven't already signed up for our email distribution list, please do so and you will receive that notice. Just stay engaged. Visit our webpage in general, and that pumping cap link is right there, the direct link. And our other portions of our website have a lot of other informative articles. We don't just seek to regulate and limit pumping. We're very active and have been successful in going after grants for groundwater recharge projects. And so we just received a final award letter for $7.6 million from the state of California that will go directly to this basin with no local cost share. So it's all grant funds that will be funding those types of projects. And that's not the first one we received. You can call or text to this phone number, any of your questions. I try to make myself as available as possible. My life is individual targeted outreach meetings with stakeholders. So feel free to reach out if you have something you want to ask me. But really, you know, that's one of the reasons that I do so much of that is because after I've been able to sit down and the stakeholders heard it from the horse's mouth and gets the questions answered that they need to have answered, that person then becomes an asset to me because they're out there then spreading that message to their family and their neighbors, and that's very helpful in effective outreach. And we're going to point to this in a minute here, but please create an account on the Kuwaia Water Dashboard. We're starting to take early adopters, and so that's coming up here in another slide here. So we'll talk right now about that. Actually, these are new slides. So the dashboard is it's a new tool that empowers landowners to respond to SGMA in the Kuwaia Sub-Basin. The dashboard delivers key water use insights. So we don't want it just to be a reporting system. We want it to hopefully, for agricultural users, be a tool that you can use on farm. Eventually, it's going to start out pretty basic, as many of these things do, and then we'll be adding a whole lot of bells and whistles to it going forward. We have a big wish list going, and it keeps getting bigger. It will have owner-specific water information associated with SGMA compliance. We'll be carrying over a lot of other, items too that are informational. One thing to understand is that we didn't start from scratch on the dashboard. Those of you who are familiar with the irrigated lands in the Kuwaia ILRP farm website is the foundation of this. So we started with that. There should be some familiarity for anybody who uses that website. Next slide. As I mentioned, 3 phases. So the first phase, we're going to view historical ET through our Land IQ contract. Landowners are going to be able to understand their ET in the context of your farm. So that might be new for a lot of growers, is how to gauge your irrigation, applied irrigation based off your ET. GSAs will then also be able to track the ET in relation to the new groundwater allocation and pumping cap. And one of the good things about Land IQ as a partner is that if a landowner feels that they got it wrong, they want to know about it because it's in their interest to improve their product. And we want to know about it too, of course, because we want to make sure that we're understanding your usage correctly. Phase 2, we'll be working on landowner water bank accounts, so that's the crediting side of it. That's coming. And then phase 3, water trading. So there is a water market strategy grant that is being implemented by Tulare Irrigation District that's coming up with how a water market might actually work in our area, and a water market would ultimately add or could add more flexibility in trading of your credits in distance and also through entities and GSAs. Next slide. So phase 1 benefits, water use insights, accurate evapotranspiration measurements, being able to essentially handle your water portfolio with all of the properties that you might manage. It has a flexible account setup, so a dedicated landowner engagement process is ongoing. We had to move our schedule a little bit, which actually puts more of an emphasis on early adopters before the full initial public release. And the water dashboard, the Kuwaia Water Dashboard development ensures its features best suit the needs of the local landowners, and that's why we want to get more people under the hood while we're still in the development phase. The dashboard is being developed with the diversity of the farm company structures in mind, also different types of farm operations, different types of users. We're trying to find everybody from the really tech savvy to the people who really have a hard time with technology. Here is a screen capture of the dashboard currently. There is a link to this off of our website on the main menu. If you go to the pumping cap, there's a drop down, it'll take you to the water dashboard, or actually on the water dashboard page under resources, or water pumping cap page, there's a link under resources to this particular website, the water dashboard. And then there's a link that's circled here in red, request early access, and that's where you can sign up if you want to be a part of the development before the initial public release.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start taking some of these questions. So first one, Randy, are pumping allocations the same for growers without access to surface water as they are for growers with surface water access?
Yes. And so I think I briefly mentioned it in my presentation that the board did consider kind of the haves and have-nots portion of that and doing it disproportionately, and in the end decided that they would treat those with surface water and those who are groundwater only the same. So the only difference really is primarily the undeveloped land after 2020. Yeah, January 2020 is what the current draft rules and regulations say is the milestone for non-developed lands or undeveloped.
Okay, next question from Bo. What will be the determining factor as to whether a person can transfer water 3 or 5 miles?
Well, first of all, the board is going to set a number, not a range, and then it's going to be mostly technical consultant consideration, I think, whether or not it's going to cause an undesirable result. So I think the board's intent is to try to create as much flexibility as possible without shooting ourselves in the foot by creating a condition that's going to get us in trouble with the state of California. So as long as we're in compliance locally, we can continue to maintain our local control over the resource and keep the state agencies out of it. But if we exceed minimum thresholds that we've set, and those minimum thresholds are in our monitoring are set to an undesirable condition, an impacted user or use of groundwater, so maybe a number of wells going dry, or a certain level of surface subsidence occurring, impacting critical infrastructure. If we start to see that, then we have to pull back on that flexibility. So I think those transfers are going to be probably treated like a temporary use agreement, where it's not, we'll let you transfer, 5 miles anytime you want. It'll be, you can do it this one time, and then if you want to do it again, come back and talk to us, because we need to look at our monitoring and see how it impacted our monitoring.
I think the position from most of the stakeholders and the people that I've been hearing from is we'd like to set that number a little bit higher and more flexible to start with, and then at least for year one, and then move down. But I think the board needs to be convinced that that's not going to cause an undesirable result right off the bat. So
yeah, we've been hearing the same. The board talked about it on Monday a little bit.
All right, next question from Jason. Is there a flow meter requirement, such as what type and style must be used?
That's a good question. The answer is no. However, one of our planning grants that we received, we just wrapped up a study conducted by Fresno State Center for Irrigation Technology that evaluated most of the meter technology out there, and it didn't just stop at the meter itself. It also looked at potential telemetry to transmit that information all the way to the cloud storage area where that information would be housed, and the user interface in order to access that and to query and manipulate that information. That report is now out, and it was posted to our website under resources. There was also an email sent out to our distribution list letting people know that it was available, but you can get a copy of that from any one of the 3 GSAs. So please let us know if you can't find it. It's just suggestive. It's to help you understand, but we're trying to be as flexible on especially the meters, because there's a lot of different brands and models out there. We want to try to find something pretty universal and consistent with the telemetry. That's really where the rubber meets the road for us.
Great. And then I did see some conversation in the chat regarding an issue with the poll, and if you answered yes to question 1 and didn't want to answer question 2, you weren't able to submit. So I wanted to apologize for that required question. We'll go ahead and send out a poll to the participants after the webinar if you'd still like to provide some input on that. So I wanted to address that, and also thank Ashley Goldsmith, who's helping moderate our chat. She's with Blue Chair Communications. So thank you, Ashley, for making sure people get their responses. So we'll go back here to Q&A. A question from Brian. Was the average of 80,000 acre feet of overdraft basin-wide or just the greater Kuwaia?
Yes, it was basin-wide. A little bit more than 50% of it was greater Kuwaia apportioned. So we took a look at the overall basin through a water budget and mass balance. And then there was a number of other considerations, including seepage and whose seepage is whose. that resulted in really just a discussion piece we call the Water Accounting Framework. That's contained in our groundwater sustainability plans, all 3 plans, as well as our coordination agreement between the 3 GSAs. And it does do an apportionment of responsibility, gives us a target each for 2040 that we need to correct.
Just as a disclaimer, that 20-year period, 1997 through 2017, was what led to that average annual overdraft of 80,000 acre feet for the basin. If you shift that 20-year period to 1997 through current, or move it 3 or 4 years, either way, the overdraft is much more than 80,000. So the 80,000 is probably the minimum we'll be dealing with.
Yeah, we recognized after. So that period was chosen because it was just slightly less than 100% average rainfall and just slightly less 100% average delivery off of the Kuwaia and St. Johns rivers.
All right. So a question from Robert. Can you give an example of a 1-to-1 reduction of the tiered water?
So we're at 2.75 right now, okay? Let's say that you pump 5.75. The following year, you would lose your 2.75, and then the following year, you would lose an additional 0.25 to make up that total 5 of over into the penalty tier. So 1-to-1, you use a foot too much, and you lose a foot too much in the future year.
And you'd be paying for them at the penalty rate instead of the free rate for next year. So
That's right.
it's very, if you can conserve, it's better to keep it in the year because the pricing changes too.
All right. This is more of a request from Andrew. Yes, Andrew, we can go back. He wants to see the slide that shows how much water is in the tiers. Let's see, does this have
No, it was,
my screen is covered.
so it's 10 inches in the sustainable yield bucket, and then the balance of the 2.75 is equally distributed between tiers 1 and 2. And that's something you can comment on, but that's how it's apportioned. So when we were using 2.5 as a number as opposed to 2.75, we used it for easy math because it's essentially 10 inches, 10 inches, and 10 inches, 30 inches total. But since it's 2.75, tiers 1 and tier 2 will have a little bit more than 10 inches, 11.5.
All right, I'm going to switch over to some of the questions that were sent through in the chat. Rick says that TID sent us a copy of our total water use for 2021 in acre feet used per each APN. So we have an idea of our water needs, or if we have to abandon some of our land. Will the Greater Kuwaia be able to do this for us also?
Yes, we have been trying, and I was even talking to staff here about this this morning. TID has a pretty sophisticated methodology for producing really pretty reports for it. If you want that information right now and you don't mind it just being in a spreadsheet that gives you your APN and then the field IDs, there's unique identifiers because, of course, in some parcels you have multiple fields. But the Land IQ information does parse those fields out, but we've been able to attribute the unique field IDs to APN, and if you give us your APN numbers, we can at least give you the spreadsheet. We're not to the point yet where we can give you a really nice graph or anything, but if you want just the raw data, then please let us know.
I think the dashboard, that's actually a good segue to why would you want to sign up for the dashboard. It's going to start giving you live information of ETs and past historical. They're going to try to populate back a year eventually into the dashboard of ETs.
Right, yeah.
So that'll be a good thing to be on and start being familiar with your lands and what they're getting that correct for you.
Very good point. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole reason, one of the biggest reasons for the dashboard is we won't have to do this. This is really what TID gave you, and what we're trying to get in your hands is the method as a Band-Aid. the dashboard is the ultimate solution to that. And we're hoping too that, you know, while the ET information is not delivered real time, it's delivered by Land IQ at least a month in arrears, that at the same time it's delivered by Land IQ, it's going live onto the dashboard, so you're getting it as soon as we would get it.
Great, all right. Another question that came through the chat is, will the Greater Kuwaia allow water pumping credits to be shared between parcels within the sub-basin, such as between Mid-Kuwaia to Greater Kuwaia?
Yeah, so that's something that's changed from what you would read in the draft rules and regulations. The board currently supports the answer to be yes to your question on a case-by-case basis. So if we can come up with some sort of an agreement for how that could work, then, because our rules and regulations are going to be slightly different than East Kuwaia or Mid Kuwaia. So we would have to kind of come up with a negotiated aggregate of the two in order to make sure that both GSA's needs and objectives are met to make that happen. But it is possible, whereas if you read the draft rules and regulations, it sounds like it's not.
All right, Andrew asked, if we do not grow but live on about 5 acres in Wood Lake, would we be considered residential and just pay more on our property taxes, or would we be capped and be on a meter?
You don't irrigate? Did you say that?
No, undeveloped.
Undeveloped. If it's undeveloped, well, I mean, if you're only using water for domestic purposes, it really doesn't matter. So you should, I mean, you're still going to be subject to the property assessment for that native supply, because you could theoretically, even if you're not using that native supply, move it to another property, because that is allowable under the rules and regulations. So that's part of what you pay for. But there would be no meter requirement in your case, if I understand the description.
Right. Since we talked about meters, Claudia asked, when will the water meters be installed? Potentially when will they be required?
We haven't decided on a schedule for that. If we move away from ET allocation to pumping allocation, the time frame that's just loosely been discussed is somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 years from now. And again, we might employ some sort of an incentive for people who move forward with that sooner rather than waiting to the last minute.
All right, I'm gonna hop back to the Q&A box here. A question from Dan. We have several acres that are included in the St. Johns River. How do you account for unusable acres?
Well, first of all, unusable acres are almost an asset, because our allocation is based on your property assessed acreage. So if you have a 40-acre parcel but you only farm 30 acres of it because you have roads and buildings, you're still getting an allocation for the 40 acres, not for your farmed acres. And so in a way, those unfarmed acres, you're able to, within that same parcel, stack it into the area where you actually are using it.
And the good news on Land IQ will take a polygon of your farmed acreage and they will block out like the riparian vegetation. That won't count against you in the river. So you're only being charged for what you're farming. And so that's another question we get once in a while on riparian habitat or something that's not farmed that is green.
Buildings, anything like that. And we'll be honest, there are going to be quite a few people who are going to take a first look at how things were classified by Land IQ on the properties that you operate, and you're going to see errors. And we really fully expect that we're going to hear from you and be able to make those corrections. So a truing up of what's actually happening out there. If you have unirrigated pasture land and it's showing an ET value that we assume is from pumping, but it's not, it's rainfall fed, let us know and we'll reclassify, we'll carve that out too.
Right. And a question from an anonymous attendee, what is the definition of undeveloped land?
There is a legal definition, and our attorney's not here. Generally speaking, we would look back for agricultural purposes. I think in the rules and regulations, it talks about registration to the Irrigated Lands Program. So if you're irrigating, it's, you know, and you're registered in the Irrigated Lands Program, then that's developed. But if you haven't been enrolled in that program, then that would probably raise a red flag and some questions about whether you had it developed or not by 2020.
All right.
But look at the draft rules and regs. It describes it, I think, in there. There's a section.
A question from Jason. If new wells are needed, is permission needed by the GSA to permit the drilling?
Well, the governor is to thank for that, but yes, now we have to evaluate new wells. So there was an executive order that came out, and it requires all brand new permit applications for commercial purposes anyway to come through for approval by the GSAs. And so we've been frantically trying to develop forms to work in conjunction with the counties, who are the overlying land use agency who traditionally has done that. We just submitted our first batch of backlogged applications this morning and got them denied by Tulare County, and so we're still working through it. But it's very new. We once had that was a discretionary thing for us, and now it's not.
Another question from an anonymous attendee. Are accumulated water balances transferable in case of property sale? Are balances calculated by account or by APN?
So it's a property asset. If you were to want to move that balance someplace else, you'd have to do it while you were still the landowner, because it would retain with the title of that property.
And then the second part of that was, are balances calculated by account or by APN?
Oh, it's by APN. Sorry, I missed that
Yeah.
part. Yeah, the balance is APN.
Question from Matthew. Does the transfer 3 to 5 miles include going into another GSA? So I think this is a similar question to transferring water between neighboring GSAs.
Yeah, so again, case by case, because our transfer distance limitations are going to be different than what our neighboring GSAs are. So we'd have to discuss that. You know, where is the property that transfer is originating from, and where are you taking it to, and in which GSA? So it just depends. I would say if there's an idea in your head that's specific enough that you know which GSA that would go to, I would understand what their rules and regulations state related to transfers. And again, you know, any of these kind of activities between GSAs you have to have mutual agreement between the two GSAs. So they do take some time. So be planning ahead. We can't just, you know, make snap decisions on some of these things.
Question from Robert. How long will the results of an Edison pump test be usable?
We haven't made any decisions on that. The pump test methodology has come up a couple of times in discussions. Right now, I can tell you that is viewed similarly, or could be viewed similarly to actually having a meter on your well as something that you can use to engage the GSA on the accuracy or inaccuracy of the ET methodology, to show that your usage is different than what we're calculating it to be. But it is not policy yet that you can use that in lieu. There is actually a section I would suggest, because we do want everything in written comment. And again, the written comments, it's very important to understand that they are specifically on the draft rules and regulations document that is on that page. And so read the actual document. Don't rely just on the PowerPoint presentations, but in your case, specific to your question, I would look for the section that talks about meters, because it does not talk about pump efficiency test as another alternative.
Yeah, and that's just gonna give you instantaneous flow guarantee, not a cumulative total. So if I wouldn't consider that a reliable form of ongoing tabulation of total volume. So I would discount that.
Okay, question here. When are you going to send out the Land IQ report so we will know how much ET we are using?
We're not going to send an individualized ranch report to everybody. That's just not going to happen. First of all, we don't have any firm way, absent the dashboard yet, to know all the fields that are part of your ranch and what that report should or should not contain. I know that in TID's case, they have been taking specific requests. They sent out a report that was a generalized report showing example commodities across their whole GSA, but they did not send everybody an individualized report that I'm aware of. And so I would again suggest that if you're interested, send us an email at info@greaterkaweahgsa.org and give us your specific APNs. We can make no guarantee on the turnaround time for that delivery, but we can guarantee that we will give you that information if you submit your request. The annual reports, or excuse me, the monthly reports that we get from Land IQ, this reminds me, I do need to get those posted to the website. We do have a number of those we need to put up.
Great. A question from Dave. Will the trading ability, the ability to buy credits from others, be in place by next year? So those who need to buy credits will have the ability if they wish to, so we don't get into the penalty tier.
Not by next water year, I don't think. The schedule of the water market strategy, which, by the way, if you go to TID's website, there is a page there for it if you want to get involved in that process and learn more about it. I would highly encourage it. It is an open public process, but the schedule doesn't lend itself to what you're
For water market.
for water market.
But I think our board's willing to, if a grower has fallow ground and needs to use it somewhere else, we need to figure that out as a board, how to make that work for people.
By October 1.
Yes. So I think we need, that's on our back. But true water market will be a couple years out.
Yeah, that's important to make that distinction between flexibility that we're trying to build in right now as an interim measure to eventually, full-blown market, and then giving that flexibility without also, possibly stepping on the toes of what is a more effective true water market.
All right, a question from Curtis. Is there a projection of how many wells may go dry in the Greater Kaweah GSA at the proposed pumping cap of 2.75 acre-feet per acre for the next 5 years?
We're working through that right now. What we worked off of was the original projection. So the Department of Water Resources gave us a determination letter for all 3 GSPs and asked us to make certain corrections. So we're going through that. Bear in mind too that, as I mentioned, the cap limit of 2.75 is not static. It will change, and so it could adjust if we feel like we overshot or undershot. We could move it one way or the other because it is something that, according to the draft rules and regulations, is set annually by the board. We think it's a pretty good target. It's a fairly conservative target where we looked at our plan and the original water budget and where we wanted to be in terms of chipping away at the 100% of the problem in 20 years with a 5% reduction in the first 5 years. So it is pretty close. Our consultant spent several months actually working through the numbers, and we had a pretty lengthy discussion with him on Monday about that to make sure that it was reasonable.
All right, a question on the dairy water usage. So mentioning the need to address that, what is it going to look like in October for dairy farmers?
Well, the report that we received, I mentioned that we worked with milk producers, Johnny's group, and also a consultant, Four Creeks Engineering out of Visalia, to come up with an estimate of net usage that was reasonable and equivalent to what we're employing on irrigated land. So the estimate that we came up with is exclusive to the commercial operation, the actual facility, and not the supporting fields of field crops typically. And so that the number is going to be, in line with what you're seeing. I haven't just yet posted that report, but I will make that my priority here also following this workshop. So look for the report to get an idea of those numbers on the Pump and Cap webpage under resources.
Johnny, you might touch base, dairy is a big question mark. I get a lot of questions from dairies. You might touch base on how you see a dairy operating in this new environment because of the support crops.
Well, your dairy footprint is basically using about a half an acre foot per acre, approximately. So with that footprint, you're actually gonna gain some allocation. You're gonna have your sustainable yield over the half acre foot plus your temporary, your tier 1 and 2. So that water will be able to be used on your croplands that are supporting the dairy. Of course, dairies are at particular risk because they have to comply with a nitrogen management program. So you have to grow a certain amount of crops to support the nitrogen that leaves the dairy in liquid form. So it's going to be challenging, but I think with the way the numbers are for now, we're going to be able to work through this.
Now, the calculation too, dairies are largely closed systems that do a lot of recycling to their lagoons and wash bays, and so understanding that was really what necessitated that study and that estimate, which is really just a preliminary. This will get us to where we need to be right now, but we want to seek something better in the future. We're having to do that with all commercial operations right now. So nurseries is another similar one where there's one in particular that has French drains, and so they irrigate and they recycle that water back. And so understanding what their actual net use is not always easy to come up with. And since we are holding people accountable to their net use, which is the ET, for others, we need to estimate something that's equivalent.
Eric, can you give a clear description of transfer and carryover?
Okay, transfer is movement of your groundwater allocation in space, so geographically. Carryover is to take your money or your money. It's like a bank. It's basically just not spending it and just letting it sit and accrue. So it's carryover in time. So that's the distinction, is either taking your allocation and moving it in space, transferability, or in time carryover.
And keeping it in the same parcel.
And keeping it on the same parcel, but then even if you kept it on the same parcel for a period of time, you still have the flexibility of transferability later to move it.
All right, great. Another question from anonymous attendee. If you have a parcel that has been dry land farmed, but has a usable well on it and could be farmed, can I transfer all tiers of water to my other APNs? Is
it enrolled in the irrigated lands program? That's something where I would suggest strongly to the person who asked that question to look at the language in the draft rules and regulations, because again, it does give a pretty clear, at least for now, definition of developed versus undeveloped. So whether or not there's a well doesn't necessarily mean that it would be deemed one or the other.
Okay, question from Jerry. I have a permit to drill a well and waiting on a driller. Am I going to be able to drill the well anytime soon?
Well, your application was probably one we tried to submit this morning, and we're trying to get you to that point. I can't do anything about getting your driller on site, but we'll try to do what we can to get those permits processed.
Or he may have a pre-approved.
Oh, if it's their pre-approved one, yeah, then it's that, we only deal with the ones that we're given that haven't been approved by the county. So the county, when the governor's executive order came out, all the counties just stopped work. They just hung on to them. They either turned down the applications or they just held on to them and didn't process them.
But that process is live again now, and it might be delayed an extra day or so. I think the well drillers are probably gonna handle a lot of the paperwork, as they usually do in this situation, and they have to get approval from the GSA, but it might be an extra day, but it's back live again.
Yeah, the process is not ideal right now. We're trying to improve that and the efficiency of it. Currently, the county receives, or at least Tulare County, they've been receiving the applications and then they submit them to us. And then we have a couple of forms that we have and are required. One of them is actually one that the landowner has to sign. That's essentially a waiver. And then there's another form that satisfies the governor and the counties in their process. And it's just a back and forth right now that we think we can streamline and speed it up. But the county of Tulare specifically in their well ordinance has a 10-day turnaround, and we're trying to keep it in that window if we can when we receive them.
Okay, question by Jason. If the water market will not be available by next season, will transferring be available?
Right, the way that the current rules and regs are written, yes. The transferring, I think, that's why we're trying to get the dashboard done as quickly as possible, because it's going to be really tough to do that absent the dashboard. The schedule has been super accelerated in order to get to the point where we can do that.
Okay, is there anything in place for people who have native undeveloped ground, but pumping from there and moving that water elsewhere? There would be no ET data, but pumping crazy amounts of water to move elsewhere.
That's a real challenge, and you have much larger examples of that, where you have well fields that are doing the same thing. And so the ET method is challenging there. I think that what you're going to see is a triage where some of the larger examples of that are addressed earlier. Some of the other ones maybe not, but just bear in mind that the person who, if you're pumping on, one location and moving it to the other, you're still pumping it. And so you're still going to want to register that property that you don't irrigate, that you have your well on, because it's also a part of your overall allocation. You're going to want the allocation for that property. So whether you're moving it to another property or not, it's within your conglomerate or your farming enterprise, and so your overall assets.
Once the plan is in effect come October, how will compliance be enforced, and how will fines be collected if there is any resistance?
Again, provisions are written in there. Collections agents, we're a regulatory agency, so you really have to think of us as being similar in methodology to what you would see from the regional and state boards. It can go so far as Superior Court and getting an injunction. All of those things are outlined in the draft rules and regulations. I would direct you to read that. It's not something, of course, we probably want to really talk about a whole lot, because we just really hoping that it doesn't come to that, but in all likelihood it will for some people.
All right, Charlie asked, will heifer feedlots be assessed similar to dairies?
That's a good question. So that's another one where we're going to have to do an estimate. We haven't done it yet. Dairies, again, 200 of them. I don't think we have anywhere near that of the heifer lots. But I just recently had a conversation, and the association for that industry, I have on my list as of yesterday to contact and see if we can come up with something similar. Because I know they've done estimates, and so.
Mark asked, does the half-acre foot usage on dairy ground or bare non-irrigated land count against the 10 inches of sustainable yield?
Say that again?
Does a half-acre foot usage on dairy ground or bare non-irrigated land count against the 10 inches of sustainable yield?
If it's non-irrigated, no. Well, it depends. If there's an industrial use there, that's where we're putting estimates.
If it's the dairy footprint, it will count against the dairy,
Yeah.
the footprint of the dairy.
Right.
If you have other non-irrigated ground that's associated with it, that would be excluded from that, but
I think probably the
Footprint.
example that we need to probably address is, say someone has non-irrigated pasture.
right.
How would that work? How do you see that playing?
So again, non-irrigated pasture, we would initially be getting an ET value. And if that ET value is higher than what we estimate in effective precipitation, so what could be met by precipitation, the assumption is that you either have a surface water supply or a groundwater supply, and you're using those sources to irrigate. And if we don't have something from a surface water supplier saying that it was part of that was surface water, we'll assume that the net exceedance in that demand was met by groundwater. In some cases, that's going to be a pretty small difference between, and then there might be error in the ET, and so that's where we would work with that property owner to address that in the classification and potential exclusion of that property in what we would bill to based off ET. A long way to say you could get an exemption.
All right, so going back to the dryland farm question in the ILRP, can you enroll the dryland farm in ILRP now, and then would you be able to transfer all the water?
Only your native, because you would be enrolling it, unless it was previously enrolled, prior to January of 2020. But again, that's something that you could comment on. We started with 2015 because 2015 is really codified in the state legislation is when we as GSAs are responsible moving forward to be responsible, what we're responsible for. So any condition that occurred prior to 2015, we're arguably not responsible for. But we really wanted to make sure that we were focusing on our GSP adoption date, which was January 2020, and moving forward past that.
All right, a question from James. If you have riparian rights, can the unused groundwater be transferred?
The groundwater can. Your riparian right has limitations for, so in some ways, I mean, that your sustainable yield of groundwater is more flexible than your riparian right because your surface riparian right is limited to its beneficial use on that property.
And he added, or banked, transferred or banked.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so on a dry year when there's no riparian water, you might want to bank your water to use it.
And you also have situations where it's unirrigated pasture land, and so that particular landowner could carry over or bank over multiple years that 10 inches, and stack more and more 10 inches, and then choose to transfer the full balance some other time.
All right, an anonymous attendee asks, why do wells need a state well number as said in the rules and regulations?
That's something that we might take a closer look at because the state well identification numbers are an imperfect process. It was a system that was never really set up very well to begin with. And there's a concern, a real concern, because it was poorly managed from the beginning of those numbers. The new numbers that are being given to these new wells might be duplicative. So, and they need to be unique IDs. And so sometimes you do see where the state doesn't even give the well a state well ID. So that's a good observation.
All right.
I'm going to note it.
Christina has a bit of a scenario. So there's multiple APNs that make up the ranch, and the wells on the ranch service these multiple APNs. In addition, the APNs are in different GSAs. So can they share their allotment of water across the acreage, even if it is from one APN to another, and if the APNs are in separate GSAs?
Yeah, I mean, there's really two parts, to that. First of all 3 GSAs are using the ET evaluation. And so, the amount that you use may be pumped from East Kuwaia and to properties in the Greater Kuwaia, but the Greater Kuwaia will be measuring the properties that you apply that groundwater to, and so you would be paying Greater Kuwaia for groundwater pumped in East Kuwaia. So there's that dynamic that makes it complicated. There are discussions ongoing by certain landowners who are straddling the GSAs about potentially just modifying boundaries in order to just permanently alleviate that concern. That is possible between GSAs fairly easily within a sub-basin. So if it's any of the 3 GSAs in the Kuwaia sub-basin, what would be required there is, again, mutual agreement between the 2 GSAs, and each of the boards of the 2 GSAs would have to adopt a resolution and modify the boundary, and then provide that documentation to the State Department of Water Resources, and then it's done. The boundaries along sub-basins or basins, so in our case, north to the Kings sub-basin, west to the Tulare Lake sub-basin, and south to the Tule sub-basin, that's a much more difficult process to make those permanent boundary changes. Only very rarely does the state allow a process where you can request those kind of modifications.
I think part of the question you didn't answer, but there will be some kind of transfer mechanism when you're straddling those lines to be able to work that back and forth. That's just going to have to be agreed upon.
Yeah. So if you want to, well, first of all, I mean, the example I gave you, if I were the general manager of East Kuwaia, I'd be concerned about that, and I know it's going to happen to me too. But so if we want to come up with some way that we can equitably account for that in our water budgeting and crediting and so on and so forth, the 2 GSAs would have to come up with a form of agreement that outlines those parameters. But absent that, you would just be held accountable based on the acreage that you apply that water to. We eventually want that all cleaned up, though.
Christina asked if she should contact you directly to work on this issue.
Yes.
Okay.
And depending on who the other GSA is that you're referring to, you would want to contact them too. It takes both. I've had some difficulty with at least one of the GSAs where haven't been so responsive on some of these requests.
And the good thing to note, because I was working on the dashboard and development, when you register for the dashboard and you're in multiple GSAs, it'll pull up your APNs, it'll show it. They'll be highlighted a little differently, but you click on east and west. That'll be a great tool to register it all and have a visualization to bring into Eric or the East Kuwaia, whoever it is, to see what the scale of the issue is, big picture. And by registering, it'll do that and give you the visual too, and the different rules on each parcel.
Yeah, the more people who can pre-register, I think that once you do and you see under the hood of this tool, you start to get a clear picture of how things could work. You think of your own unique situation and you provide feedback, and you get that feedback in during a time when it's easy to make those kind of developmental corrections.
All right, question about rules and regulations. What is the procedure of amending something in the rules and regs after adoption?
The board can amend and will likely have to, because this is a really basic first version of the rules and regulations, and so over time it will grow in size based on certain needs. There'll be times, I'm sure, that we'll think we need to change something because we didn't make the right decision, and so it will happen. It's no different than our groundwater sustainability plan, which we're already 2 years later already modifying. So all of this is an iterative process, and so really it would just take the will of the board and a need maybe recommended by staff or consultants to modify it.
All right, a question from Dave. Said, going back to the question about people pumping and moving water, he said the person asking was suggesting there are certain large companies pumping on the west side of Greater Kuwaia and moving it to another GSA, draining Greater Mid-Kuwaia's basins. And what power does the GSA have to stop this?
So you're absolutely right. And I will make sure that people understand that where our boundaries end is the limit of our jurisdiction. So if there are wells or even a well, whatever it might be, just on the other side of the fence, we have no control over that well. And many of these wells that are focused in that particular area of our sub-basin, I don't know that enough people realize how many of those wells that are impacting that condition out there are actually outside of our jurisdiction. The vast majority of them are outside, just outside. We have had one entity out there with a portion of a well field, was in the Greater Kaweah GSA. They donated 5 of those wells, the ones that were in our GSA, to us. They basically just decommissioned them, and then they're helping us turn those into monitoring wells. Recognizing, I think, that by doing that, then we don't have any authority over any of their wells. So there's definitely some gaming going on with respect to that, but I can tell you that the wells that are within our GSA that are extracting and exporting, there are draft ordinances for groundwater export that the counties have developed, and the GSA so far have been able to convince the counties that that's something that the GSA should be handling. And so we have been exploring our options, but we've been trying to do it in a collaborative fashion with the owner operators of those wells. But we don't have any policy in place just yet.
All right, there's a follow-up on amending the rules and regulations. The attendees requesting some clarification on, does the board have to create another draft and it goes through public review? Does the board vote to remove or add things? How would that work?
Yeah, so there's already, in this slide, the 2 slides that I showed you of the change in thinking, rather than create a whole bunch of different versions of the rules and regulations, because the way that public comment periods work is that you work off of a single draft. And so we've been advised not to continue to do a whole bunch of drafts during this period, but rather discuss the comments that we've received and document in a separate document, which is posted on that page. It's position tracking by the board to show where thinking has changed. But ultimately, the amended version that would be up for adoption by the board would be publicly available in the agenda packet for the board meeting where that would be considered.
Right. Well, panelists, you've answered probably over 45 questions. And looks like we have no more at the moment, but just in case anyone's typing, we'll go ahead and give folks a little more time.
This is why we ran through the Sigma 101 really fast, trying to save as much time for Q&A.
I have a question while we're waiting here, because the land IQ data is 30 to 60 days behind by the time you get it. Are we going to be allowed to do transfers retroactive to when the pumping actually occurs?
That'll take some discussion. Yeah, I don't see why not, though. I mean, probably past history is going to mean a lot.
I think so.
Yeah.
Especially in the first year.
You bet, if we can get that retroactive a year, ETs, and then you can kind of, you know, at least analyze what amount we're talking about during that 60-day period while it's non-confirmed. You know, I don't see why not.
There's not a day that goes by that you don't go, oh, I hadn't thought about that.
Every question we answer.
No.
That's 3.
Opens up another 3, yeah.
All right, we did get another question in here. If fines are levied, will that come up in a title search when property changes hands?
I don't think it would if the fines are paid, but if there's a lien.
There's a lien.
There's a true lien. That's going to be court action.
Mhm.
I think that'll be a concern as landowners in the future, when you're going to buy a piece of property, you go, well, what's your water balance? And it was never a thought 20 years ago, oh, I'm gonna buy that piece of land. Now you're gonna say, oh, that guy's negative, I'm not buying that land, it has a debt. So that'll be something to think about, where things won't show up when you're selling or buying land.
All the financiers will want
Yeah,
to
I
know.
wanna know, that'll be the new finance
Your
question.
financial position and your water balance.
Appraisers,
Appraisers,
yeah,
All this
Yeah.
and you're gonna see lease agreements changing language.
Yep.
This is really gonna change a lot of things.
Another position report.
Yeah.
All clear for now.
Under 2 hours, impressive,
Uh,
shortest one yet. Okay, well, I really appreciate your participation. We've tried to get as much information out there, and I know it's not always easiest in this format, and sometimes you might not want to ask a question that drops it out to everybody on the call. So if you do have questions that you'd like to just reach out to me or any one of us directly, please do. Okay, well, with that, I want to thank you again and let you all get on with your day 20 minutes early today. So, thank you.